It was a Tuesday afternoon when the doorbell rang, a sharp chime cutting through the usual suburban hum of lawnmowers and distant barking dogs. I shuffled to the door, still half distracted by the lingering scent of damp laundry and the faint whiff of Nimbus omnipresent catnip. Opening the door, I was met with the sight of Mir. Jenkins, notebook in hand, wild eyes shining behind his thick glasses. An expression that suggested had just discovered the meaning of life, or at least the secret to Nimbus's strange powers.
"Ah, just the man I wanted to see!"
he exclaimed, stepping inside with the confidence of someone who had cracked a code only he could understand. "Nimbus, you say?"
"The cat! Fascinating creature!"
I blinked, unsure if I was about to be enlightened or further plunged into madness. "Yes, Nimbus." "Why?" Mr. Jenkins wasted no time. He pulled out a crumpled page from his notebook, covered in sketches of clouds, lightning bolts, and what looked suspiciously like a cat with a lightning bolt tail. "I've been tracking weather anomalies in this neighborhood for years," he began, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But since Nimbus arrived, localized shifts in weather fog, sudden gusts, even that indoor thunderstorm coincide perfectly with his presence." Nimbus, true to form, sat atop the windowsill, tail twitching, emerald eyes fixed on Jenkins with an unblinking stare that somehow made the whole room feel colder. "I call it the feline atmospheric influence theory," Jenkins continued, waving his hand as if conducting an invisible orchestra of storms. "There's precedent for this in ancient mythologies, cats as guardians of the weather, mediators of the skies." I half smiled, partly in disbelief and partly because the whole thing was so absurd it could have come from a Terry Pratchett novel. "So you think Nimbus is some kind of weather god trapped in a cat's body?"
"Exactly!"
"And those Latin murmurs, arcane incantations?"
"His communicating, controlling."
Before I could respond, Maggie appeared in the doorway, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. She took in the scene, me looking exhausted, Jenkins looking like he'd just found his life's purpose, and Nimbus, the inscrutable feline monarch. "Should I be worried, or is this a new episode of suburban surrealism?" she quipped dryly, handing me a cup. Jenkins beamed as if Maggie's sarcasm was the highest form of praise. Listen to her, the voice of reason amid the storm. Nimbus yawned, revealing a perfect set of tiny teeth, utterly indifferent to the human chaos swirling around him. The afternoon wore on with Jenkins detailing his theories, showing me weather charts annotated with cat paw prints and ancient symbols. Maggie occasionally interjected with sharp-witted remarks, grounding the conversation as I oscillated between skepticism and a strange, growing intrigue. At one point, Jenkins pulled out an old book from his bag, pages yellowed and dog-eared, filled with illustrations of mythical creatures and weather gods. "See here," he said, pointing to a figure strikingly similar to Nimbus. The Nimbus Phyllis, a guardian of storms, revered in forgotten cultures. I glanced at Nimbus, who was now perched like a small black statue on the bookshelf. His unblinking gaze seemed to pierce through the layers of disbelief I was trying to maintain. Was it possible that amidst the absurdity, there was a sliver of truth? "If this is true," I said slowly, "then what do I do? How do I live with a cat that might be controlling the weather and speaking Latin?" Jenkins grinned, notebook poised for more scribbles. "You negotiate, my friend. You learn the language of storms and cats. You become the worshipper he demands." Maggie snorted. "Or you just get a really good umbrella and hope for the best." Nimbus blinked once finally, after what felt like an eternity, and stretched luxuriously, as if he were utterly pleased with how the meeting had gone. As Jenkins packed up his notes, promising to return with more revelations, I stood by the door, coffee warming my hands, heart oddly fluttering between amusement and a creeping sense of awe. Could Nimbus really be something more? Or had I finally crossed the line from pet owner to bemused believer in the bizarre? Only time and perhaps more late-night Latin murmurs would tell. But one thing was certain, life with Nimbus was never going to be ordinary again. It started as a desperate experiment. After days of Nimbus ruling the house with his unblinking gaze and cryptic Latin mutterings, I was grasping at straws, or rather, at whatever might pry open the iron door of his inscrutable personality. That's when I remembered catnip, the old standby of cat owners everywhere, a simple herb that turned the most aloof feline into a rolling, purring puddle of joy. Surely, if anything could distract Nimbus, it would be catnip. I approached with cautious optimism, catnip sachet in hand and Nimbus perched on the windowsill, eyes like emerald lasers locked on me without a hint of blinking. He seemed to sense the ritual about to unfold, or perhaps he was merely humoring me, which, given his usual disdain, was a generous assumption. With a furtive glance to ensure the neighbors weren't spying through their curtains, I scattered a pinch of catnip on the living room carpet. Then the moment of truth I watched. At first, Nimbus sat still, the picture of regal composure, but then something subtle shifted. His tail twitched a slow, deliberate flick that spoke volumes in cat language. Next, he leapt down with the grace of a shadow dissolving into moonlight and landed squarely in the catnip patch. What happened next was nothing short of miraculous, or at least, hilariously unexpected. Nimbus, the unblinking, weather-controlling enigma, abandoned his solemn throne and erupted into a frenzy of feline abandon. He rolled on his back, paws batting at the air like a tiny, furry sorcerer casting spells of chaos and delight. His green eyes, usually so sharp and commanding, sparkled with a mischievous glee that felt almost human. I couldn't help but laugh, a genuine, belly-deep laugh that shook the dust off my weary spirit. Here was Nimbus, the possibly supernatural cat, reduced to a writhing, purring heap of joy by a simple herb. The absurdity of it all was delicious. For a few blissful minutes, the house was transformed. The oppressive tension of weird weather shifts and ominous Latin whispers gave way to the lightness of a catnip-induced play session. Nimbus chased invisible foes, his tail flicking like a conductor's baton, orchestrating chaos in a way that felt oddly endearing. Then, in a sudden pause amid the frolic, Nimbus locked eyes with me. For a fleeting second, that unblinking stare softened no longer the gaze of a meteorological overlord, but something almost affectionate, almost vulnerable. It was an unspoken truce, a moment of shared understanding across the vast gulf of our species and sanity. But as the effects of the catnip waned, the old Nimbus reasserted himself. He rose, shook his sleek black fur as if casting off an invisible spell, and returned to his silent vigil by the window. The temperature shifted ever so slightly, and a faint murmur of Latin drifted from his throat once more. I sat back on the couch, still chuckling, feeling the strange comfort of that brief interlude. Nimbus was undeniably a creature of chaos and mystery, but beneath it all, there were glimpses of something more. Maybe not quite ordinary, but definitely more than just a cat. And so, armed with a newfound appreciation for the humble catnip, I resolved to keep experimenting. If nothing else, it was a reminder that even in a world turned upside down by supernatural cats and inexplicable weather, there was still room for laughter, for play, and for moments of unexpected connection. The adventure with Nimbus was far from over, but for now, the house felt a little lighter, and that was a victory worth savoring. As I watched Nimbus settle into a rare, contented purr, I wondered what other surprises this enigmatic cat had in store. Could the simplest things still disrupt the most complex of beings? Only time and plenty more catnip would tell. But one thing was certain: life with Nimbus was never dull, and neither was I. And just as I was starting to relax, I heard it again, that faint, unmistakable Latin whisper, echoing from the shadows, reminding me that the game was still very much afoot. Tempest is imminent, Nimbus seemed to say. The storm is coming, and with that, the calm was over. The chaos was about to return. But for now, I had catnip, and that was enough. I had never thought a routine trip to the vet could feel like an expedition into the unknown. But then again, Nimbus was no ordinary cat. Clutching the sleek black feline in my arms, I walked into Jill's clinic with a mixture of hope and unease. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a clinical glow over the waiting room filled with the usual suspects, yipping dogs, curious kittens, and a rather disgruntled parrot that seemed to glare at Nimbus with suspicious intensity. Nimbus, however, was unfazed. His unblinking emerald eyes scanned the room with the calm of a monarch surveying his kingdom. I half expected him to issue some decree or summon a thunderstorm to silence the noisy animals, but he simply sat there, serene and aloof. Jill greeted me with her usual warm smile, though I could detect a flicker of concern beneath her professional facade. "So, what brings you and Nimbus in today?" she asked, gesturing to the exam room. I hesitated, trying to find the right words that wouldn't sound completely absurd. "Well, it's complicated. Nimbus has been exhibiting some unusual behaviors. I thought a checkup might help." I trailed off, feeling the weight of my own skepticism. She nodded knowingly, as if she'd seen her fair share of eccentric pet owners. "Let's take a look, then." The exam room was bright and spotless, with posters of various animals decorating the walls. I carefully placed Nimbus on the examination table, half expecting him to leap down and disappear into some shadowy corner. Instead, he sat stiffly, his posture regal, his eyes never blinking. Jill approached cautiously, her hands gentle as she began her examination. She checked his ears, nose, and mouth, all the while muttering professional observations. "Good teeth, no signs of infection or inflammation," she said, making notes on her clipboard. Then came the moment of truth, the eye exam. Jill pulled out a small flashlight and shone it into Nimbus's eyes, expecting the usual feline contraction of pupils. But Nimbus's pupils remained fixed, unwavering, as if he were staring into an abyss, or perhaps the abyss was staring back. "That's unusual," Jill murmured, raising an eyebrow. Cats usually blink and their pupils respond to light. Nimbus, as if on cue, let out a low, almost imperceptible murmur. I leaned in, my heart pounding. It sounded like Latin, or at least something that wasn't English or any modern language I recognized. Jill's pen nearly slipped from her grasp. Did he just speak? "I think so," I whispered, caught between disbelief and fascination. She recovered quickly, though, and proceeded with the stethoscope. Placing it gently against Nimbus's chest, she listened intently. Heart rate is steady, strong. No murmurs or arrhythmias. Nimbus let out another soft phrase, again in that strange ancient tongue. Jill glanced up, her professional demeanor cracking into a smile tinged with amusement. "Well, that's a new one. Usually, the only language we hear here is barking or meowing." I laughed nervously. "Yeah, Nimbus isn't exactly your average cat." The rest of the examination continued with Jill running through standard tests, checking reflexes, temperature, and so on. Each time she asked a question or made a comment, Nimbus seemed to respond with a knowing stare, as if silently judging the proceedings. When the session ended, Jill shrugged. "Physically, Nimbus is in perfect health, behaviorally though. Well, we never met a cat quite like him." I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and renewed mystery. "Any ideas?" "Honestly, no. But I'd keep an eye on him and maybe keep a notebook. You never know with pets. Sometimes the strangest quirks turn out to be nothing, and other times, well..." She trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging in the sterile air. I knew exactly what she meant. As we left the clinic, Nimbus settled back into my arms, his unblinking eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the horizon. I couldn't help but wonder just how deep this rabbit hole went. Maybe I was crazy. Or maybe Nimbus really was something more, something ancient, enigmatic, and endlessly amusing. Either way, the adventure was just beginning. The morning began like any other suburban Saturday, with the sun peeking through the curtains and casting a gentle glow over the quiet street. Birds chirped in the usual off-key symphony, and the scent of freshly cut grass wafted in from somewhere down the block. I had just poured myself a cup of coffee when the first signs of trouble made themselves known, not inside my house, but just outside the window. Tom's front lawn was drenched, not in the usual dew or lingering night moisture, but absolutely soaked, as if a small rain cloud had taken up permanent residence above his prized petunias. The rest of the neighborhood, basking in warm sunlight, looked on in confused silence. I rubbed my eyes, half convinced the caffeine hadn't kicked in yet. "Tom," I called, stepping out onto my porch, the soft creak of wooden floorboards punctuating the quiet. He stood there, arms crossed, drenched from shoulders to boots, eyes fixed upward in disbelief. "I don't get it," he muttered, voice tinged with frustration. "It's sunny everywhere else, but look at this!" He gestured helplessly to the soggy mess his garden had become. "My tomatoes are going to rot before they even get ripe." I shuffled over, clutching my umbrella uselessly as the drizzle continued unabated above Tom's yard. Nimbus might have had a hand in this, I admitted cautiously, glancing back toward my house where the sleek black silhouette of my cat sat motionless on the windowsill. His green eyes, unblinking and eerily steady, seemed to gleam with an almost imperceptible hint of amusement. Tom arched an eyebrow. "Your cat? Come on, man. That's a bit far-fetched, even for you." "I know it sounds crazy," I said, swatting at a stray drop of rain on my forehead, "but Nimbus isn't like any other cat. You remember the weird weather quirks IV mentioned? The sudden gusts, the temperature shifts. This feels like an extension of that." Tom sighed, shaking his head. "Well, if your mystical feline is raining on my parade, maybe you should do something about it." Before I could respond, a few neighbors emerged from their houses, drawn by the unusual localized rain and the spectacle of a soaked man complaining about the weather on a sunny day. Murmurs grew louder, eyes darted suspiciously toward my house, and I felt the heat of their curious, judgmental gazes. "Hey, everyone," I called out, trying to sound casual despite the knot tightening in my stomach. "Nimbus isn't your average cat. It's complicated." Maggie, ever the pragmatic voice in my chaotic life, popped her head over the fence from her yard a few doors down. "Complicated. That's one way to put it," she said dryly with a smirk. "Looks like your cat's got the whole neighborhood talking." I glanced back at Nimbus, who remained seated like a dark sentinel, his gaze unwavering. I swear if cats could smirk, he'd be doing exactly that. The rain continued its steady fall over Tom's yard, droplets pattering rhythmically against the leaves and pooling in the flower beds. The smell of wet earth mingled with the faint scent of Nimbus's for an oddly comforting but surreal combination. It was as if the cat had conjured the storm just to remind us all who was really in charge. "I'm sorry about this, Tom," I said, shifting uncomfortably. "I'm trying to figure out how to keep Nimbus from turning the neighborhood into his personal weather lab." He gave me a wary look. "Just make sure he doesn't start a tornado next, all right?" I laughed, though it came out more like a nervous cough. No promises. As the neighbors slowly retreated back to their homes, whispers trailing like the fading raindrops, I realized that Nimbus's antics were no longer confined to our household. The suburban calm was cracking, revealing the absurd, chaotic undercurrent that Nimbus had brought into our lives. Back inside, I found Nimbus still perched on the windowsill, eyes locked on the dissipating rain cloud above Tom's yard. I knelt beside him, speaking softly. "You've got to give it a rest, Nimbus. We're neighbors, not weather gods." He blinked once, an actual blink this time, and I could swear there was a hint of mischief in his gaze. The battle between normalcy and chaos was only just beginning, and I was already losing. But maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what I needed. Just as I was about to close the window, a sudden gust swirled through the room, scattering a few loose papers across the floor. Nimbus's tail flicked with calculated precision, and the faintest murmur of Latin passed his lips, too quiet to catch, but unmistakably there. "Great," I muttered, reaching for my notebook. Time to start documenting again. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, but I knew this calm was only temporary. Nimbus's weather was as unpredictable as his demands, and so was life with the cat that never blinks. Working from home was supposed to be a blessing. No commute, comfortable clothes, and the luxury of taking a break whenever the urge struck. but with Nimbus around, the concept of normal dissolved faster than my morning coffee, often literally. I settled into my usual spot by the window, laptop open, earbuds in, and a hopeful heart ready for productivity. The clock struck 9, and my first video call pinged. I smiled professionally at the screen, exchanged greetings, and began presenting my quarterly report. That's when it began. A sudden, inexplicable breeze wafted through the room, lifting scattered papers like miniature birds in flight. My hair stirred against my face. The light flickered. I glanced at Nimbus, who sat serenely on the armchair, his unblinking green eyes fixed on me, as if daring me to make sense of the chaos. A low rumble echoed softly, like distant thunder but indoors. "Excuse me," I muttered, trying to maintain composure. "Technical difficulties." My coworkers exchanged puzzled looks as the breeze intensified, carrying a faint scent of rain and damp earth. I scrambled to grab the fluttering papers, knocking over my coffee cup in the process. Dark liquid spread across my notes, ink bleeding into an abstract watercolor of failure. I might need to reschedule, I confessed, disconnecting before further disaster struck. Coffee, I decided, was non-negotiable. I shuffled to the kitchen, Nimbus silently trailing behind, his sleek black fur a stark contrast to the fluorescent light above. Filling the kettle, I tried to focus, but the whistle erupted in erratic bursts, a chaotic symphony to accompany my frazzled state. Nimbus's gaze never faltered, his eyes gleaming with inscrutable intent. Just as I reached for my notes again, a sudden draft billowed the curtains, and the steaming liquid spilled onto my papers once more. "Really?" I groaned. By mid-afternoon, Maggie arrived, her sharp eyes immediately assessing the disarray. "Looks like Nimbus is hosting a weather event," she quipped, stepping inside and surveying the scattered documents and half-empty coffee mugs. Her sarcasm was a balm to my frayed nerves, grounding me in the absurdity of the situation. Nimbus perched on the windowsill, watching the sunlight flicker through shifting clouds outside, perfectly at ease in the eye of his own storm. Maggie shook her head. "You need to stop trying to fight it. Just roll with the weirdness." I sighed, sinking onto the couch beside Nimbus, who curled up with an almost regal air. Outside, the street gleamed wet, then suddenly brightened as sunshine broke through the clouds, a subtle reminder that Nimbus's influence stretched beyond these walls. I rubbed my temples, exhausted but oddly comforted. Maybe acceptance was the key. Maybe, just maybe, working from home with a cat who controlled the weather would never be boring. And with that thought, I braced myself for whatever chaos Nimbus conjured next. Maggie's grin was the kind that suggested she was both amused and plotting something mischievous. I opened the door to find her standing there, holding a folded piece of paper like it was a fragile treasure. "Got something for you," she said, her voice the perfect blend of sarcasm and encouragement. "A date?" "Yes, really." I blinked. Not Nimbus style, the cat's unblinking stare was something else entirely, but just a regular human blink, confused and slightly panicked. "A date?" I echoed, glancing over my shoulder at the empty living room where Nimbus usually sat like a dark sentinel, eyes wide open, as if watching the very fabric of the universe. Maggie nodded. "Yes, I figured you could use a break from worshipping your feline overlord. Plus, it's not like Nimbus has offered to set you up himself." I took the paper from her. It was an invitation to a small gathering at a friend's house, casual, nothing fancy, but enough to make me nervous. "Okay," I admitted, "but I'm warning you, Nimbus might have other plans." Maggie laughed. "That's what makes it fun." That evening, I stood in front of the mirror adjusting my shirt for the umpteenth time. My reflection rumpled and anxious looked back at me, while Nimbus sat unmoving on the windowsill, his eyes locked on the darkening sky outside. The air in the room felt thick, charged like the calm before a storm. I caught him muttering something under his breath, Latin, of course, and I swear the temperature dropped a few degrees. I tried to ignore it. Tonight was supposed to be normal, at least as normal as life with Nimbus could get. Then it happened. A sudden gust of icy wind swept through the living room, scattering napkins from the coffee table and causing the candle flames to dance wildly. Nimbus's low chanting grew louder, a rhythmic cadence that sent shivers down my spine. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and twist, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I scrambled to gather the scattered napkins, muttering apologies to my date who was due any minute now. "Nimbus, please," I whispered, "not tonight." But Nimbus didn't blink. Instead, he leapt down gracefully and settled in the middle of the room, his green eyes glowing faintly in the candlelight. The storm inside the house intensified, lightning flickers in the corner of my vision. Thunder rumbled softly, and the windows fogged up as if we were caught in a midsummer tempest. The doorbell rang. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door to reveal a woman standing there, umbrella in hand, eyes wide as she took in the minor indoor storm. Wow," she said, stepping inside cautiously. "Welcome to the Nimbus experience," I quipped, trying to keep my voice steady. She laughed, the sound warm and genuine despite the bizarre setting. "So, this is your cat?" "Yes," I said, "and no, he doesn't normally do this on dates." As the evening unfolded, Nimbus's antics continued, light flickers, strange murmurs, and occasional chilly breezes, but instead of driving my guest away, it sparked something unexpected. Laughter. Conversations about the absurdity of life, the mysteries of pets, and the unpredictable nature of companionship. By the time the date ended, the storm inside had calmed, and Nimbus was once again the silent, unblinking observer. I realized something important. Life with Nimbus was chaotic, yes, but it was also full of moments that defied explanation and brought people closer in the strangest ways. As I closed the door behind my guest, I caught Nimbus's gaze. For the first time, it felt less like a command and more like an invitation. Maybe, just maybe, I was beginning to understand what it meant to live under the reign of the cat that never blinks. And that was a beginning worth celebrating, storm or no storm. But just as I started to relax, a faint murmur of Latin whispered from the shadows, and the lights flickered once more. I sighed, smiled, and prepared for whatever absurdity was next, because with Nimbus, the night was never truly over.